to today's webinar. Today's presentation will focus on the newly revised 4th edition of the ANSI IICRC S500 Standard and Reference Guide for Professional Water Damage Restoration. Today, your host will be Standards Director Mili Washington, Standards Chair Howie Wolf, and S500 Consensus Body Chair Mickey Lee. They are going to be here to discuss the newly revised standard and some of the primary revisions made since the 2006 edition.
Thank you, Jennifer. This is Mili Washington, IICRC Standards Director, and I'd like to just go over a summary of the standard development process that we at IICRC have used for the revision of the ANSI IICRC S500 2015 version. The ANSI document, it's an American national standard. We have been through the ANSI approval, which essentially means that the American National Standards Institute approves, reviews, accredits the process of development that we follow for our new and revised standards. They review and approve the process, but not the technical aspects of the document itself. The ANSI essential requirements for due process are the basic tenets that ANSI requires all of its accredited standards developers to follow while developing new and revised standards. And a summary of the essential requirements entails having openness in the standard development process, having a lack of dominance in the membership of the consensus body, having balance on the consensus body that reviews, develops, and approves the standard, having a consideration of all views and objections that are presented throughout the process of development, a consensus vote, which is the consensus body approval vote on the standard, having a written appeals mechanism for any unresolved objectors, and having written procedures that outline all of the requirements for due process. Throughout the process of developing the revision of the S500 standard, the consensus body put the draft standard out for 5 rounds of open public review. The first public review started in April of 2013, and the 5th one closed in July of 2015. We received hundreds of comments from public review commenters, and the consensus body proceeded to review, address, and respond to all comments and make changes to the draft document accordingly. Upon completion of the public review process and approval by the consensus body, the standard was submitted to ANSI for approval, and ANSI approved the S500 as an American national standard in October of 2015, and IICRC has published the S500 standard in November of 2015. Just as a summary of the consensus body members that were involved in the revision of the standard, Mickey Lee served as the chairman of the S500 Consensus Body. Mickey Lee represents Mickey Lee Consulting. Chris Taylor served as the vice chair of the S500 Consensus Body. Chris Taylor represented Aspire Education Institute. In addition, the consensus body members included Brandon Burton from Legend Brands, Larry Carlson from Phoenix Restoration Equipment, Jim Holland from Restoration Consultants, Ron Rees from REE, and Howie Wolf from HW3 Group. And with that, I will pass this on to Mickey Lee, Chairman of the S500 Consensus Body.
Thank you, Millie, and welcome everyone. We appreciate everyone who is viewing this. And standard of care is what the consensus body is, what the S500 is. And standard of care is defined as practices that are common to reasonably prudent members of the trade who are recognized in the industry as qualified and competent. It should not be construed as being a best practice document which has a specific definition, nor should it be construed as a state-of-the-art document which also has a specific very high level of development. And so this is a standard of care document. As with previous S500 standards and many other of the IICRC standards, there are two sections to it. There is the standard represented in the blue pages, and then there is the white pages, which are the reference guide. So the standard is an ANSI IICRC document established by due process and consensus that describes the principles, criteria, procedures, methodology, and precautions for a given activity. Whereas the reference guide is a supporting document. It is not the standard of care, but it is a supporting IICRC document, guidance document that usually accompanies a standard, and in this case it does. In future versions and editions, there will not be a reference guide published at the same time as the standard itself. The reference guide embellishes and further explains the procedures, methodologies, and that are set forth in the standard. In the standard of care, of course, there are several levels of denotion, and shall or should is considered a component of the standard of care. Shall, of course, being a regulatory component of the standard of care. Recommended, these are not standard of care procedures and activities. And then an additional couple of words, may and can, denotes permissive or possible action. So the bottom line is not everything that is written in the standard of care and the reference guide rises to the level of standard of care. It is not a shall or should. One of the paragraphs that received a lot of comment and was the subject of the fifth round of public review, once it was written in this format that you're looking at, it received a lot of positive comments from all of the materially interested parties who responded. This standard and reference guide is not intended to be either exhaustive or inclusive. Restorers should use professional judgment throughout each and every project. However, the use of professional judgment is not a license to not comply with this standard. A project might have unique circumstances that may infrequently allow for a deviation from the standard. And the last paragraph is the sentence that was actually revised prior to the fifth round of public review, and it reads, prior to deviation from the standard of care, i.e. shall or should, the restorer should document the circumstances that led to such a decision, notify the materially interested parties, and in the absence of timely objection, document the communication before proceeding. So this wording allows the restorer to make decisions based on professional judgment. It directs them to document the reasons for making that deviation, and then provides a means and appropriate time for review from other materially interested parties. Many restorers, of course, are very familiar with this restoration triangle. There are three people in the restoration triangle. The owner is, of course, the person who has the issue and is generally plopping around in the water, having one of the worst days of his or her life. And then there is the restorer and the insurer. Both of these parties, the restorer and insurer, of course, have the professional and contractual responsibility of helping the owner or occupant to return to their home or business as quickly and efficiently as practical. The S500 does not take the position of advocating for any single one of these constituencies. The standards and guidance procedures are written primarily from the point of view of the project and what it needs in order to be returned to a pre-intrusion condition. So our advocacy would be for the project primarily instead of for any single constituent. Just a summary, a recap of the primary changes that have been made in the fourth edition. The first bullet point, we redefined the classes of water intrusion to offer a more objective means of estimating the evaporation load in a building, basing it on the square footage of the wet affected materials in a space that needs to be dried, rather than by the vague descriptions that were in the third edition, such as part of a room or water that, quote, may have come from overhead, etc. So the language now provides for a much more objective means of estimating that evaporation load in a building. The second bullet point, we restructured the inspections and structural restoration chapters to flow generally in the order a restorer would perform the activities on a typical water intrusion project. This should make the guidance more practical and much easier to follow than previous. Third, we've consolidated information on many materials that was previously scattered in 3 different chapters, that is building science, inspections, and in structural restoration. We consolidated this into a more user-friendly table of materials and assemblies. This table at the back of the reference guide describes over 80 different materials and building assemblies, as well as providing recommendations on dealing with them in different categories of water. Fourth, the structural restoration section provides a rationale for air mover placement based on the amount of wet affected surfaces in a space. This should provide the appropriate amount of air movement to handle all classes of water intrusions, from the mildly wet class 1s to the very wet class 3 projects in small rooms, large rooms, as well as large areas of commercial buildings. And then the fourth significant area, we strengthened the third-party references in the science chapters. That is the building science, microbiology, psychrometrics, and drying technology chapters. This should provide better support for stakeholder decisions, as well as enhance the credibility of the document. What you see now is a table summary of the changes, and just a quick look at chapters 1 section and chapters 1, 2, 3, 8, and 9. You see that there was significant chapters that only minor wording changes were made, and in some of the others, such as the chapter 8, only minor wording and flow changes were made in that chapter. Whereas in the building material science chapter, basically we moved discussions on specific materials and assemblies to the new chapter 17 table. As you see, the psychrometry and drying technology chapter was rewrote significantly. And in the chapter 7 biocide and antimicrobial technology, we basically clarified the direction on cleaning being preferable to biocide application, while still allowing its usage as needed. The last sections in the standard, as well as in the reference guide, you see here again chapter 11, chapter 12, chapter 14, chapter 16. All of these basically received very minor wording changes. And then in chapter 10 and chapter 13 on inspections and structural restoration, much of the changes and many of the changes in these 2 chapters were restructuring the workflow to match how these processes are actually performed on typical water damage projects. In chapter 13, that structural restoration, there was significant rework in the flow, as well as the procedures on remediation and controlled demolition being performed prior to restorative drying. The definitions of classes of water, as we've already mentioned, that received significant rework. There are now 2 examples of dehumidifier calculations, and then the air mover calculation, of course, was significantly reworked. So in the categories of water, the definitions of the categories of water, there were virtually no changes made in the category 1 and 2. The only change in category 3 was that we changed the wording backflows that originate from beyond the toilet trap to become waistline backflows that originate from beyond any trap, as of course we all know there are more traps in a waistline in a sewer system than just the toilet trap. And then the fourth category, which was called special situations, has now become regulated, hazardous materials and mold. So as we look at the definitions of the classes of water, this is just a table summary of the definitions, and you see 4 columns. To the left, classes of water, 1, 2, 3, 4, no change. The second column, which is a description of the amount of water absorption and evaporation load. In the third edition, it was also called least significant, greatest, and deeply held or bound water. So there was no change in the broad definitions of the class 1, 2, 3, 4. When it comes to the actual calculation, it is now according to the amount of wet porous materials as a percent of combined floor, wall, and ceiling surface in the area, and are in the space. When we talk about the space, of course, we're talking about the drying environment, the room or the chamber that we are conditioning. So if in one space, if there is less than about 5% of the combined floor, wall, and ceiling surface that is actually wet and affected, then that would be considered a class 1. And then as you follow class 2 and class 3, it's increasingly more amount of wet porous materials as a percentage of the surface area. So if it's more than, of course, approximately 40% of the combined areas, then of course that would be a very wet building, and that would be considered a class 3. Now we come to the fourth column, and where we talk about absorption into low evaporation materials or assemblies. And so the question of course should come, what are low evaporation materials or assemblies? And this is the definition that the consensus body crafted, and it has gone through public review and a considerable comment, and people seem to be understanding this very, very well. Low evaporation materials are materials that, due to their porosity, permeates, or internal structure, absorbs and transmits water very slowly. Examples of low evaporation materials may include, but not be limited to, plaster, wood, concrete, and masonry. So these are very dense materials where water is going to be absorbed slowly, and then it is going to be given off and evaporate slowly in the material. Low evaporation assemblies are very similar to low evaporation materials, but they are assemblies that, due to their construction, exhibit similar qualities to low evaporation materials. In other words, they absorb or transmit water very slowly. These assemblies may include, but not be limited to, multi-layer wallboard, multi-layer subfloors, gymnasium floors, or other complex built-up assemblies. So this is low evaporation materials and low evaporation assemblies. So you can see in class 1, 2, and 3, there would be minimal absorption into these low evaporation materials or assemblies. So the wood, the plaster, the concrete is not significantly wet. It's more just a surface moisture that is present. However, in category or class 4 water intrusion, of course, that would be where there is significant absorption into these types of materials. And as you see, the double asterisk note below, drying of these materials may require special methods, longer drying times, or substantial vapor pressure differentials. So that's the definitions of class of water and intrusion. And now we come to, we're going to highlight several changes. And one of the significant changes would be to psychrometrics and the drying technology, Chapter 5. So you see we rewrote this chapter to reflect sound science and application. And some of the things that are mentioned in that chapter are not only psychrometrics, moisture mechanics and materials, how moisture migrates through materials, constant and falling rate drying concepts, role of energy in moisture diffusion and transfer, factors that influence the evaporation rate, and then also managing the drying environment throughout the drying project. Over 30 footnotes were put into this chapter from 21 unique published sources, so we feel that this gives us much greater third-party research and credibility for the document. Additionally, in the other science chapters, microbiology, health effects, building science, you see that additional footnoting and resource was provided for these sections. So let's move to probably the most significant changes that were made, and that was in Chapter 13, the structural restoration. There was significant rework to the flow and procedures. In Category 2 or 3, contaminated losses, remediation should be done prior to aggressive restorative drying. Now, this does not eliminate the potential of doing controlled dehumidification and stabilization to reduce the potential for secondary damage, humidity damage in a project. Secondly, removal of wet, unrestorable materials should be done prior to aggressive restorative drying. Of course, you should not dry what's actually going to be removed, and so therefore the direction here is to remove those unrestorable materials and then begin your aggressive restorative drying effort. In this section also, there are 2 examples of dehumidifier calculation methods. These are not a part of the standard of care. You should, of course, calculate dehumidification need, but the method of calculating that is offered here is a simple and a detailed method. The simple method is one that most everyone who has been a reader of the document prior is very familiar with. It is sometimes called the ASD chart. It's the pints of water removal method. The detailed method provides a way that a restorer could take into account the building construction, the weather impact to the drying environment, and this type thing. So there are 2 dehumidifier calculation methods that are provided, that are offered. And then finally, of course, the air mover calculations based on amount of wet affected surface area, which will provide needed air movement for all classes of water intrusions. The last chapter is the chapter of on table of materials and assemblies. This is a new chapter which draws considerable information from previously chapters, building science, inspections, and structural restoration, and it places it into a much more user-friendly table. Characteristics, evaluation, and restoration procedures are offered. These pages has over 31 referenced footnotes from 25 unique sources, and it describes over 80 materials and built-up assemblies. I will now just show you 2 rows out of those 80 materials and assemblies. So, of course, this is going to be fairly small print, but It shows on the far left column the type of assembly or material it is. In this one, it's gypsum wall board, also known as wall board, drywall, plasterboard, sheetrock. Then it gives a number of characteristics, and it has the reference where we took most of this information. Then under the final three columns, you see category 1, 2, and 3, and it gives recommendations on what its restorability, on extracting the water from this from these assemblies, on cleaning them, on drying them, and what type of airflow generally would be recommended under each one of these three categories. This one, next line item is laminate flooring, and again, you have information and then recommendations for dealing with these under category 1, 2, and 3, and the reference note where this information came from. The section that received probably the majority of, or many comments was the section 13561, which dealt with the air mover calculation. And I will not go into huge detail on this. I'm going to just basically read the guidance on this and then show you one example of how this could be calculated. So upon initiating the restorative drying effort, restorers should install one air mover in each affected room. In addition to that, so every room would get one air mover at a minimum. Room or affected space, such as closet, room, bathroom, kitchen, etc., would each receive one air mover in each one of those spaces. In addition to that, add one air mover for every 50 to 70 square foot of affected wet floor in each room. These air movers are intended, of course, to address the floors and the lower wall surfaces up to approximately 2 feet. Then an additional air mover for every 100 to 150 square feet of affected wet ceiling and wall areas. So if it's wet above approximately 2 feet, then that needs additional air movers on those upper ceilings and wall areas. Then in addition to that first air mover, of course, you're going to add another air mover for each wall inset and offset that is greater than about 18 inches. When a calculation for a room or space results in a fraction, the indicated number of air movers should be rounded up. And then finally, there are situations where water has migrated under a wall into an adjacent room. And so this last paragraph is intended to provide air movers for those situations. It reads, in circumstances where water migration has primarily affected lower wall sections and limited flooring, for example, less than about 2 feet of a migration out into the room, into an adjacent room or area, then restorers should install a total of one air mover for each 14 affected linear foot of wall. So this calculation, of course, is independent of the above square foot calculation, and they are not meant to be used in the same room or area. So that's the wording of section 13.5.6.1. And now just an illustration of how that would be used. If we have this floor plan, you have a kitchen, you have a laundry room, you have a master bath, a hall bath, and then a small closet. So basically you have 5 rooms or spaces in this. And so you see there in the upper left, you see in the kitchen, you have 1 for the room, and then 4 to 5 for the square footage, and plus 1 for the offset. So in that kitchen, you would have either 6 or 7 air movers that would be available to be placed in that kitchen. In the small laundry room, of course, you would have 1 for the room and you would need no additional ones for the square footage or for any offset, and so you would have one air mover there. Then in the master bath, hall bath, and closet, you see each one of those, you have one for the rooms, and for the master bath and the hall bath, you would have one for the square footage, and then the totals on the master bath, hall bath, and closet, you see would be 2, 3, and 1 respectively. These totals would provide 13 to 14 for that space. As we have discussed this with various stakeholders, with various restores, it was obvious from speaking with them that this would provide sufficient air movers for all of these spaces. Many scenarios of room sizes and various classes of water intrusion has been modeled using this calculation, and the consensus has been that it does provide an appropriate amount of air movers for a wide range of projects, for small rooms, large rooms, residential and commercial, and in losses that have incurred varying degrees of water damage. Additional guidance has been provided for Class 4 intrusions. So in Class 4 intrusions involving significant water absorption into low evaporation materials and assemblies, once surface water has been evaporated, the vapor pressure differential between the materials and the air, the surrounding air, that vapor pressure differential should be increased. For example, increasing the temperature of wet materials would increase that vapor pressure differential. Reducing the humidity of the surrounding air would do the same, or a combination of both, increasing the wet materials temperature and reducing the humidity of the surrounding air. Both of those could be done. In these circumstances, it can be beneficial. Of course, once the surface water has been evaporated, it can be beneficial to potentially decrease the velocity of airflow across those surfaces where water is being diffused within that material. So this is the direction on Class 4 intrusion. We've now gone through all of the significant changes that have been made in the document. Hopefully this has been a good review and an introduction to this edition of the S500. And with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Howie Wolf, who will talk about the purchase and other things having to do with the S500. So Howie, I give it to you. Howie?
Mickey, this is Mili. I can take over.
Okay, go right ahead.
That's okay. Okay, thank you. Just some information on how to purchase the revised ANSI IICRC S500 2015 version of the standard. The IICRC web store, which is webstore.iicrc.org, has all versions of the standard available for purchase. We have print, we have PDF. We're adding EPUB versions to the site as well. In addition to the web store where you can get the individual standard itself, you can also purchase a subscription to all of IICRC standards, and that's on our subscription site, which gives you access to either basic subscription, which is access to all of our current standards on an annual basis for annual subscription, or a premium subscription, which provides access to all IICRC standards, which is current and historical standards for an annual subscription. The way to purchase a subscription is through the IICRC web store, which is the first link on the page, webstore.iicrc.org. And once the subscription has been purchased, you would need to log in and access your content using the second link, which is publications.iicrc.org. The subscription site provides online access to each of our standards. You can view the standards by section and by chapter. You can download individual sections or chapters and do a full text search on entire standards to find any term that you may be looking for. In addition, it also allows you to highlight certain text, copy, paste, share portions of the content through whether it's email or social media. It gives you options to share the content. So essentially what it provides is online access. You log in and access your content on any device. There are some digital rights management software that has been put in place, so one cannot download the entire document, but sections and chapters at a time can be downloaded. So we urge you to review the subscription site if that's of interest, and the individual standard is also available on the web store. And with that, just to close out, just wanted to provide contact information. If there are any questions, they can be forwarded to me, Mili Washington, IICRC Standards Director. The email is mili, M-I-L-I, @iicrc.org. And if you have information that you're looking for on standards, that would be iicrc.org/standards for information on that. And with that, I just wanted to thank Mickey Lee for the presentation, Howie Wolf, Jennifer Peterson for the webinar, and if there are any additional questions,